everyone, I'm Joy and welcome back to my channel. I am currently 36 weeks and 3 days today, so I am getting really close to giving birth and I'm going for my second unmedicated water birth. I'm going to be sharing some tips of how I got through my first unmedicated birth and some things that I'm doing to prepare for my second unmedicated birth. As I just said, my first birth was an unmedicated water birth and it was a really cool experience and I loved it so much that I want to do it again. When I first got pregnant with this baby, I was honestly a little bit nervous about giving birth unmedicated again because there were a couple of moments that were super intense and honestly pretty painful during my first birth, and I think I honestly I didn't tell my birth story in the most positive way. Like I did, but I feel like I underplayed exactly what I went through just to kind of make other people feel comfortable, if that makes sense. Like I was like, oh yeah, it was just really intense, and I don't know, like I was kind of like, I was trying to be too humble or too modest about my story, but in reality, I felt so empowered and I felt like just this crazy rush of emotions afterwards. So this time around when I got pregnant, like a couple of those fears started to creep in about, oh my gosh, do you remember this part? That was really intense and that was really painful. So I have really been trying to prepare myself mentally and physically to give birth unmedicated again, but to have an even better experience. Like I want this experience to be a lot more spiritual and very calm and just absolutely beautiful and magical. And we'll kind of get into everything that I've been learning and what you can do to kind of prepare for an unmedicated birth. Also, I just want to know whether you go unmedicated or you end up getting an epidural. I think that these tips will be really useful and helpful for either one, because in both cases you are going to be laboring, you are birthing a baby. So I think all of these tips are applicable for either way you give birth. I just want to note that I am not a medical professional and I am not a childbirth educator. This is just purely off of my experience and what I'm kind of doing to prepare for labor. So this is just kind of some information that I found to help me. So my number one and probably the most important tip when it comes to having an unmedicated birth is to educate yourself. And I feel like most tip videos are going to say that one as well, because it is so important. So it's important to educate yourself about the process of birth, about all the different laboring positions, how to get your body ready for labor, and breathing techniques. There is so much that goes into preparing for an unmedicated and even just regular labor. I'm going to be linking down below some videos that have been really helpful to me, and I feel like that I used in my first birth and honestly that I'm using for this birth as well. And also a couple of creators here on YouTube that I love Bridget Taylor. She is very I feel like she's very wholesome and very nurturing and has this very down to earth vibe. She's a doula, childbirth educator. I think her business is called Built to Birth, which I think that is just so cool. There's also Sarah Lavonne, and she is very she's a little bit of the opposite of Bridget. She's very upbeat and ready to go. And she's really fun to watch, and I think she has really educational content as well. She is also a nurse and a doula, so she has a little bit of that medical experience if that's what you're looking for. So both are very different, but they both have such great information. And then another one is Pregnancy and Postpartum TV. I forget what her name is, but she goes by Pregnancy and Postpartum TV here on YouTube, and she does a couple of childbirth education videos, as well as she does a ton of pregnancy workout and postpartum workout kind of videos. So if that's something you're interested in, I would highly recommend her as well. So those are kind of some of my favorite childbirth educators here on YouTube. There is also Pain Free Birth on Instagram, and she has a lot of good information as well. Those are some of my favorites, and those are some people that I would highly recommend that you check out, especially if you are wanting to go for that unmedicated and natural labor. It's also super important to educate yourself on different types of breathing techniques in labor. And I think it's good to learn all of the breathing techniques so you just have that in your tool belt, because you're probably gonna find a couple that you absolutely love and some that you're like, I don't know if I'd actually use this. But when you're in labor, you just don't know. You don't know what you're gonna need, so it's best to have as many tools in your tool belt as you can. My favorite breath is probably the De-Stressor Breath, which is basically you breathe in for 4 seconds and breathe out for 6 seconds. And it kind of varies, you can kind of play around with those numbers, but the most important part is that you breathe in and then you breathe out longer for a longer time than you breathed in, if that makes sense. Because breathing is what gets you through the contractions. That is the main thing that gets you through contractions, through early labor, active labor, transition, and honestly pushing. And for my first birth, I wasn't as educated about breathing through pushing, and I did end up tearing, whereas I've learned now that if you breathe through the pushing phase and you breathe the baby out, you're at a lower risk for tearing. So that is what my goal is hopefully to not tear. Also, when it comes to educating yourself, it's also good to realize what fears do you have surrounding birth, because what I've learned during this pregnancy is what's called the it's called the fear, tension, and pain cycle, which basically a fear creeps in and then you get really tense, and then because you have this fear and this tension, it creates a lot more pain. And I think that's kind of what happened to me when I gave birth the first time. Is once I hit that transition phase, I started to get really scared and really tense. I just remember my shoulders were literally up to my ears and I was so tense, and the nurses were like, get your shoulders down. They literally had to push my shoulders down because I was tensing so much and I was getting so scared of the contractions. Whereas if I just kind of let them come on and just breathe through each one and got rid of the fear of having the next contraction, then I probably wouldn't have been so tense. So kind of identifying your fears around birth, and that's what I've done with this one. I think my biggest fear was the transition period and then tearing. And with my first birth, I didn't really feel the tear. I mean, I felt the ring of fire and stuff like that, but it was more of the aftermath of the tearing. Mine was a very internal tear. So they were like, oh, we don't know how far up it goes. And it was a very kind of stressful and slightly traumatic situation. I wouldn't put it in the trauma category. It was just so much going on, and I want to do whatever I can to avoid that. Another thing to educate yourself on is perineal massage, which you won't do until the very end. So I'm at the very end of my pregnancy, so I'm going to be starting to do that. And I will link a video down below if tearing is one of your fears. My midwife recommended it, and I know a lot of people kind of recommend it. There's not any concrete proof that it helps, but I feel like if you have it in your mind that at least you're doing something to help, I think that will take a lot of that fear away from you. Another tip that I feel like is really important when it comes to just getting your mind into the right space when it comes to giving birth is to listen or watch positive birth stories. People who just had a really good experience, who talk about their birth in a very positive manner. I think it helps you kind of realize, oh, birth doesn't have to be this scary thing. Birth is actually this really empowering and really cool thing that our bodies are literally made to do and that we can do. We were made to birth, or Bridget Taylor's business is called We Are Built to Birth, which I think that is so cool. With my first birth, I feel like I watched and listened to the whole spectrum of birth stories, because I was like, okay, I filled myself with these positive birth stories, but I also wanted to hear the realness of birth stories. And I think that is important, but you definitely don't want to go down the rabbit hole of that kind of stuff, because I feel like, to me, what I was doing is I was putting in my mind, I was like, okay, it's gonna hurt. I have to prepare that it's gonna be painful. And yes, I think mentally you should prepare that it's not gonna be oh, I birthed a baby and I didn't even feel anything. It's not really like that. But I feel like I went a little too deep into the, okay, preparing myself for the pain, prepare myself for pain, and like seeing these people do it. And I was like, okay, like she's screaming during her labor. As long as I don't scream during my labor, I'll be fine. So just kind of be careful with birth stories. So make sure that you are listening to really positive ones. I think Bridget Taylor, as I mentioned her before, she has a podcast called Built to Birth as well. And they tell all their like positive birth stories on there. And I think she does a couple on her YouTube channel as well. And yeah, there's tons of positive birth stories out there. So just really look for them and kind of look for the ones that you really resonate with, especially people who tell their birth in kind of a light and a very empowering way. Another tip I have is to have a birth plan or a birth goal or birth idea, basically. And a birth plan is not a strict, rigid schedule of how your birth is gonna go, because let's be honest, if you've given birth before, no matter how much of a schedule you try to make out, it's not gonna go the way you planned. Like my dream birth is I was like, okay, I'll go into labor at like 10 a.m. after I've had a really good night's sleep, and I'll just labor during the day, and I'll have the baby in the evening, and it will all be magical. No, that's not how it went. I went into labor at 2 in the morning after like 2 hours of sleep, so I was very tired. But it's really good to just get an idea of how you would like your labor to go. And Sarah Lavonne has a really good saying. She says, flex and flow. So basically have an idea of what you want, but also kind of go with the flow when things don't always go to plan. So let's say like my birth plan is I want to have a water birth, but I also want to labor at home for as long as possible, and I only live about 5 minutes away from the hospital. Let's say I labor at home for so long and I make it to the hospital and they're like, oh, you're 9 centimeters, no time for a water birth. Like, I need to be okay that, you know, even though my intention and my goal is to have a water birth, I could very possibly not have a water birth, and that's okay. And I still need to prepare for all of the options. Or even if you go into it with this plan of like, hey, I'm gonna do it unmedicated, I'm not gonna get anything, and all of a sudden, you know, you go into labor and you've been in labor for like 14 hours. Sometimes that happens to people, and you really need the epidural because you just need to get some sleep. You need to make sure that you're not hard on yourself and you're not blaming yourself or making yourself feel like a failure if things don't go to plan. Because honestly, the most important part is that you are birthing a healthy baby and that you yourself are also healthy through the process. If you go for an unmedicated birth and you have to end up getting an epidural, you're not a failure. Like, you're still birthing a baby, you're still doing hard work, like you still had to go through contractions, and that's okay. Like, you did a really great job and you're gonna still meet your baby. It's gonna be good. So some tips for what I'm doing personally for my unmedicated birth is I am going to be listening to hypnobirthing and doing a lot of birthing affirmations. I actually found on Instagram a Christian hypnobirthing, and like literally the account is just called Christian Hypnobirthing. If you don't know what hypnobirthing is, it's basically kind of like almost getting into a meditation of like just relaxing your body and breathing and kind of like a lot of these affirmations. I feel like sometimes actual hypnobirthing can be a little bit woo-woo for me, meaning like that it's very focused on your own internal power and your own strength and you're this and you are a goddess woman and all this stuff. Whereas the Christian hypnobirthing talks a lot about like scripture and relying on God as your strength and just really kind of making your birth a very spiritual and God-focused experience. And that's ultimately my goal with this one. With my first birth, like I was kind of like a lukewarm Christian, and I feel like, you know, I just basically relied on my own strength for that birth. Whereas this birth, I have really been strong on my walk with Christ for a little over a year now, almost a year and a half. So I really want this birth to be focused around God and just creating a very spiritual, beautiful, and calm just experience and surroundings. And I feel like that's kind of what that Christian hypnobirthing audio does. And I think there might be, if I can find it on YouTube, I think she did all of the audios on YouTube, or you can download the app, and I think the app is like $5 or so, and you get all these tracks. It's like an hour worth of tracks that it's like birth affirmations, encouraging scriptures, how to breathe, and all that stuff. All right, so a couple more tips and then I'll wrap this up. So this next tip is kind of a little bit of a, I feel like you're gonna hear this in almost all the other unmedicated tip videos, but it's to exercise. It doesn't mean like go and do intense exercises or anything like that, but especially as you're nearing the end of your pregnancy, you really want to focus on things like squats and getting one of those like big, what are they called? Getting one of those big exercise balls and sitting on that. And I feel like that helps a lot with your posture. You just want your hips wide and kind of doing like hip circles and like going around like that. And it's really good for kind of like loosening up your hips, eventually getting baby into the right position. And honestly, having a birthing ball, I just recently got one at Target for like $11. I had a coupon or something. And since having it, like I feel like it has boosted my confidence when it comes to giving birth, because at most hospitals, at least here in America, they usually will provide a exercise ball. And so kind of like practicing some positions that I would use for birth or just like laboring positions has helped me feel a lot more confident going into this birth. Oh, walking is also a really, really good exercise for, especially towards the end of your pregnancy. It really helps, especially when the baby's head down. It kind of helps them get into the pelvis the right way. And it's just good for you, honestly, in general. People say that giving birth is like a marathon and not a sprint, which is super true. So you really just want to kind of like prepare your body. Yoga or stretching is really good for your body as well. It kind of like really helps open up your hips and just like is really good for overall relaxing. It's important to relax during your pregnancy. You don't want to be highly stressed out or anything like that. Another tip that I'm doing this time around is I'm doing, and I think I mentioned this earlier too, but I'm going to be doing perineal massage, because I did not do that with my first birth and I did tear, as I said. So I'm going to be trying that this time around, and I think they usually recommend starting it at around 36 weeks, which I am 36 weeks. I haven't started that because it just, I don't know, it feels kind of like weird and intimidating, but I would rather do that and like maybe hopefully prevent tearing than to go through the tearing process, like the healing process again. I'll link a video down below about like all about it. Basically, as I said, there's not any super concrete evidence that it works, but there is some evidence and like a lot of like personal testimonies saying that it does work. Also with this is one that you do really want to check with your doctor and make sure that they okay it, or your midwife or whoever you're working with, just because like maybe you are at a little bit higher risk, or maybe they just don't believe in that. Just kind of like educate yourself, ask your medical provider, all that good stuff. Another thing, again, ask your medical provider, is doing evening primrose oil. The last time I took evening primrose oil orally, and I know you could do it vaginally, I was just like, I don't know if that really works. So this time around, I am gonna try, you insert it vaginally. I think you can either like poke a hole in it so that way the oil gets out faster, or you just kind of put it up there and it will kind of dissolve on its own. Most people recommend that you do it at night, just because you're sleeping, you're not really walking around, whereas like if you walk around, you might start like leaking oil, which no one really wants that. So yeah, that's something that I'm doing differently this time, and I'm really hoping that it helps prevent any sort of tearing. And even if I just get like a 1st degree tear, I will be happy with that, because last time I had a 2nd degree tear, but it was like borderline 3rd degree tear, like it was pretty bad. So I do not want that again. Kind of like the last tip for an unmedicated birth, and again, this one's a little bit of a cliche, but it's to just really pay attention to your nutrition, especially towards the end of your pregnancy. So some things that you can really do to help prep your body for labor are drinking red raspberry leaf tea, eating dates. I know both of those, I'm pretty sure, have been proven to have some sort of effectiveness to them. And that's what I did with my last birth. I only had a 6-hour labor with that one. And I really feel like that eating a bunch of dates, I think they say 6 to 8 dates per day. However, if you have diabetes or the gestational diabetes, you probably don't want to eat dates just because they're a very high sugar content, or you just definitely want to check with your doctor to make sure that's okay. Dates are really good for helping ripen the cervix, and then red raspberry leaf tea is really good for helping tone your uterus. And I started drinking red raspberry leaf tea around 25 weeks or so. Again, check with your medical provider, but I only drank it like a couple times a week, and then once I hit about 35 weeks or so, I started to drink it every day, and now I'm at 36 weeks and I'm drinking it about twice a day now. At least with my last labor, I feel like it was really helpful in helping my uterus just contract super well. And then some other like just basic nutrition stuff is obviously drinking water is really good for you, whether you're pregnant or not. You should always be making sure you're drinking enough water, but especially during the end of your pregnancy, you really need to make sure you're drinking enough water. And I know it's kind of annoying to drink water, honestly, at this point, because I feel like I am peeing every 30 minutes. Speaking of which, I have to go now. Okay. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, water. Definitely want to make sure you're drinking water. And another thing that I've been doing lately is I've been trying to incorporate drinking a smoothie at least once a day, because I feel like I can put a lot of like veggies, like I can put a lot of spinach in there, and I can put a lot of fruit and just like a lot of like nutritional stuff in there. Drink it all up and not have to worry about anything. I feel like it's just a really easy way to kind of get your fruits and vegetables in. And it's never too late to start doing any of these tips. So, you know, like let's say you're where I'm at, you're 36 weeks pregnant and you're like, oh gosh, I haven't been exercising, my nutrition hasn't been good, I haven't been preparing. Like, that's okay. You still got time. Like, you have at least a couple of weeks left. Just start today. Like, any prep is really good for you. Anyways, I really hope these tips were helpful. I'm sorry if this video is a little bit on the longer side. I didn't realize that I'm actually very passionate about this topic, so I really hope this was helpful to you. If you've given birth before, or you're also preparing for an unmedicated birth, definitely let me know down below in the comments, and let me know kind of like some tips that you would recommend if you have any that weren't on this list, or any tips that you loved. I would love to hear that. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next week. Bye. Shoot, what was I gonna say? Pregnancy brain. That's not the word I'm looking for. What word am I looking for?